I spent 20 minutes in the mudroom sorting through Diane's soccer gear, pulling out the cleats that were still caked with dry, gray Idaho dirt. It was late October, and the air in Idaho Falls had turned sharp, the kind of cold that frosts the windshields by 6 in the morning. I moved the bags to the laundry room, shaking out a damp jersey that smelled like old grass and effort. I've handled the morning rush and the afternoon pickups for 3 years now. Being a stepmother in this house mostly means I'm the one who knows where the missing left shoe is and which brand of granola bars Diane actually eats. Lance and Janet, her biological parents, handle the big things, the medical consents, the school registrations, the legal signatures. I'm the one who keeps the wheels turning for a 13-year-old, but I've learned to stay in my lane. It's easier that way. After the laundry was started, I sat down at the small desk in the corner of the bedroom to check the school portal. I usually do this on Tuesday nights to make sure nothing is lurking in the inbox before Wednesday morning. I saw a new message from Mrs. Gable, Diane's math teacher. The email was brief. Hi all. Just confirming that based on the conversation between Lance and Janet last week, we have moved Diane into the advanced algebra track. Please ensure the placement confirmation form is signed and returned by Friday to finalize the schedule change. I stared at the screen. I hadn't known about a conversation, and I certainly hadn't known about a track change. Diane had been struggling with her current workload, and I'd spent the last 3 weekends sitting at the kitchen table with her, helping her untangle quadratic equations while she groaned into her notebook. We had talked, Lance and I, about maybe getting her a tutor, or at least making sure she didn't feel underwater. We hadn't talked about moving her into a harder class. I checked the portal's shared calendar. There was no note, no mention of a meeting. Just a sudden shift in her classes, decided by Lance and Janet, while I was the one who'd be stuck helping her with the extra homework. My chest tightened, that same old feeling of being pushed to the edge of the conversation. I could have called Lance right then. I could have asked why I was the last to know about a decision that would directly affect my Tuesday and Thursday evenings. But I didn't. I waited until he walked through the front door at 5:30, smelling like the credit union and the cold air. He dropped his keys on the side table and headed straight for the kitchen. I followed him, leaning against the door frame. I see Diane's been promoted to genius status in algebra, I said, keeping my voice light, almost playful. Lance paused, his hand on the handle of the fridge. He didn't look at me immediately. What do you mean? Mrs. Gable's email, I said. The honors track. I didn't realize she'd been scouted for the big leagues. Lance turned around, his expression neutral. He had this way of looking at me that was perfectly polite, but didn't actually invite any further questioning. Oh, right. Janet and I talked about it. It just made sense for her long term. When did that happen? I asked. Last week, sometime during the handoff on Friday. He opened the fridge and pulled out a carton of milk. It's a good move, Mel. She needs the challenge. I just wondered why it didn't come up when we were talking about the tutor, I said. I wanted to say, I'm the one who helps her with the homework. Why am I the last to know? Instead, I shrugged. I guess I missed the memo. I'll just add advanced algebra tiers to my weekly schedule. Lance chuckled, a short, dry sound. He didn't acknowledge the frustration under the joke. You're always exaggerating. It'll be fine. She's smart. The form is due Friday, I reminded him. I'll handle it, he said, already moving toward the living room. I can just e-sign it. I stayed in the kitchen, looking at the empty space where he had been. I knew he would handle the signature. He always handled the signatures. He and Janet had a rhythm. A whole separate way of talking that had nothing to do with me. They would discuss a need, reach a consensus, and then the result would land on my desk as a task to be managed. I thought about the way Diane had looked last week, exhausted and blinking back tears over a worksheet. Now she was going into a faster lane, and the decision had been made in a parking lot during a custody swap. I could have pushed. Diane came through the door. 10 minutes later, her backpack slumped low on her shoulders. She didn't say hello. She just dropped her bag on the kitchen island and stared at the counter. Mrs. Gable gave us the first module for the honors track, Diane said, her voice flat. It's due Monday. I don't understand the first 3 problems. I reached for the laptop to log into the portal and pull up the instructional video. When I navigated to the algebra section, the Advanced tab was grayed out. A small pop-up appeared. Access restricted to primary guardians. I looked at the screen, then at Diane's tired eyes. I had the daily labor of the household. The laundry, the rides, the tutoring. But the login for her school was held by people who didn't have to deal with her Tuesday night meltdowns. "Let me see the paper," I said, pulling the worksheet toward me. "Dad said you'd know how to do it," she whispered. I stared at the complex equations, feeling the weight of a decision I had no part in, but was now expected to fix. I spent the next hour trying to reverse engineer the math problems, using a generic textbook I found in the back of the hall closet. Diane sat beside me, her chin resting in her palm, staring at the page with a look of profound betrayal. Every time she hit a wall, she'd glance at the laptop screen, where the access restricted message remained a digital wall between us and the instructions she actually needed. "I can't do this without the video," Diane said. Her voice had that brittle quality she got when she was trying not to cry in front of me. "The teacher said the video explains the shortcut for the third section." "We'll figure it out," I said, though I was mostly lying. I was a fleet maintenance planner. I knew how to schedule a dozen mechanics and 100 trucks, but I hadn't touched a quadratic equation since I was 17. I felt that familiar frustration, being the one who gets blamed if it fails, without any way to make it work. Lance came back into the room around 7, carrying a stack of mail. He looked relaxed, the tension of the credit union left behind at the office. He saw us huddled over the table and smiled. "How's the genius track going?" he asked. "We're stuck," I said, gesturing to the screen. "I can't get into the advanced portal. It says I'm not a primary guardian." Lance didn't seem surprised. He didn't even look at the screen. "Right. The school is weird about that. I can just download the videos and put them on a thumb drive for you tomorrow." "That doesn't help her tonight," I said. "The module is due Monday. It's Friday," he reminded me. "We've got the whole weekend." He leaned over and patted Diane on the shoulder. "And don't worry about the hard stuff. I already told Janet we'd get that tutor we talked about. We're all set for Sunday afternoon." I paused, my pen hovering over the worksheet. "The tutor we talked about?" Lance blinked, his expression open and confused. "Yeah, the one from the middle school list. Janet liked her reviews, and I told Diane she'd be coming over Sunday at 2. It's already handled." I looked at Diane. She looked back at me, her expression neutral. Though she shifted slightly in her chair, she had known. "Yes." Lance's "we" didn't include me. He had coordinated a service, a schedule, and a financial arrangement with his ex-wife, and then he'd promised the child a solution. All while I was the one sitting in the trenches of the actual homework. "I didn't know we were doing a tutor," I said. "It just made sense," Lance said. He started sorting the mail into piles on the table, moving the worksheet aside to make room for a utility bill. Janet was worried about the jump in difficulty, and I agreed. It's a win-win. Diane gets help, and Janet feels like she's contributing to the academic side. "And I just provide the snacks and the ride to the library?" I asked. I could have said, "I am the one who spends 4 hours a week with her. I am the one who knows she's exhausted. Why am I the last person to know about a tutor in my own house?" I wanted to tell him that I felt like a hired hand in my own house. Instead, I let out a short, sharp laugh. "Great. I'll just clear my social calendar for the next decade. Maybe I can charge the tutor for the privilege of watching her do the work I've been doing for free." Lance chuckled. He didn't see the warning. He took my sarcasm as a sign that I was just venting. A little bit of Melanie being Melanie. "You're so dramatic," he said, his tone affectionate but dismissive. "It's just a tutor, Mel. It takes the pressure off everyone." "The pressure is mostly on the person who can't log into the portal," I muttered, but I didn't push it. I didn't want to start a fight on a Friday night, and I didn't want to be the difficult stepmother who messed up the peace between him and Janet. I watched him walk away to take a phone call, his voice dropping into that polite, professional register he used for clients. I looked back at Diane. She had stopped looking at the math. She was tracing the grain of the wooden table with her finger. "Did Dad tell you about the tutor on Friday?" I asked. "Yeah," she whispered. "He said it would make things easier." "Easier for who?" Diane didn't answer. She just shrugged and pulled the worksheet back toward her. I stayed at the table long after she went to her room. I looked at the worksheet, the ink smudged where Diane had erased a mistake too many times. On Sunday at 2, I would be the one to clear the table, prepare the water and snacks, and manage the tutor's arrival while Lance was likely out or relaxing. I would be the one facilitating a solution I hadn't been allowed to help design. I opened my phone and checked my work calendar for Monday. I had a fleet audit at 6 a.m., and I'd be the one waking Diane up and making sure she had the completed module in her bag. The house was quiet. Sunday arrived with a biting wind that rattled the window panes in the living room. I spent the morning doing the things that usually go unnoticed. Vacuuming the rug in the dining area, clearing the mail and the stray pens off the table, and making a plate of sliced apples and cheese for Diane. I didn't do it because I enjoyed the hospitality role. I did it because if I didn't, the tutor would be sitting in a pile of credit union brochures and old receipts. The tutor, a college student named Sarah, with a bright yellow backpack and a focused expression, arrived at exactly 2 o'clock. She was polite, but she had the efficient air of someone who didn't like to waste time. "Hi, I'm Sarah," she said, shaking my hand. "Lance and Janet sent over the specific modules they want us to focus on. Did you get a copy of the learning plan?" I felt a small, sharp pinch of annoyance. I didn't. Sarah paused, her hand still on the strap of her bag. "Oh, I thought it was a joint email. It had the priority list and the specific shortcut methods Mrs. Gable recommended for the honors track." "I wasn't on the thread," I said. I kept my voice flat. "But Diane's right here. We can just start with the worksheet." Sarah looked at me, then at Diane, who was hovering in the doorway of the kitchen. There was a brief, awkward silence where Sarah seemed to be calculating how to proceed without the roadmap the biological parents had provided. She eventually shrugged and sat down, but for the first hour she kept referring to the plan and the goals Lance and Janet set. I stayed in the room for the first 20 minutes, ostensibly to get Diane settled, but mostly because I wanted to see how this worked. Every time Sarah asked a question about Diane's pacing, or whether we wanted to skip the review section to get straight to the module, she looked at me, then looked away, as if remembering that I wasn't the one who had signed the contract or set the expectations. "Do you think we should spend more time on the graphing?" Sarah asked me. "I've been working with her on that for 3 weeks, I said. "She's still struggling with the intercepts." Sarah nodded, but then she checked her phone. Lance mentioned in the email that the intercepts were a low priority for this weekend. He wanted to prioritize the module completion for Monday. I leaned back against the wall. Right. The deadline. I spent the next hour in the kitchen prepping a roast for dinner. I could hear the low murmur of Sarah's voice and Diane's frustrated sighs coming from the other room. I was the one providing the space, the food, and the emotional support when Diane hit a wall, but I was effectively a ghost in the educational process. I was the help, not a parent. Around 3:30, the front door opened and Lance walked in. He wasn't alone. His parents, who lived about 20 minutes away in a newer development on the edge of town, followed him in, carrying a dessert tray and a bouquet of supermarket carnations. "Surprise!" his mother chirped, her voice filling the small hallway. I stopped chopping carrots and looked at Lance. He looked back at me with a beaming, oblivious smile. "I forgot to mention," Lance said, stepping into the kitchen to kiss my cheek. "My parents wanted to come over for an early Sunday dinner. They're in town for the weekend." I looked at the clock. It was 3:38. Sarah was scheduled to stay until 5. "Lance," I said, my voice low. "The tutor is in the dining room. She's here until 5. Lance blinked. He looked toward the dining room, then back at me. "Oh, right, I forgot." "You forgot," I repeated. "It's fine," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "They can just sit in the living room for a bit. We'll have dinner a little later. It's not a big deal." It is a big deal when the living room is the only place for them to wait while a 13-year-old is trying to learn advanced algebra 10 feet away, I said. I could hear his parents chatting in the hall, their voices loud and cheerful. The house, which had been a quiet zone of focused struggle for the last 90 minutes, was suddenly flooded with social energy. Diane emerged from the dining room, looking overwhelmed. She looked at the guests, then at Lance, then at me. "Do I have to stop?" she asked. "No, honey, keep going," Lance said, giving her a thumbs up. "Just ignore the noise." I looked at the roast in the oven, then at the crowded hallway. I was the one who would have to manage the flow of people, ensure the tutor had a quiet environment, and somehow coordinate a family dinner while the primary guardians stood around chatting about their weekend. "This is great," I said, my voice dripping with a sarcasm I didn't even try to hide. "I'll just tell Sarah to move the lesson to the basement so your parents can have the house. Maybe I can set up a little buffet in the laundry room while I'm at it." Lance chuckled. He didn't see the anger. He saw a quirk. "You're so dramatic, Mel. Just put some water on the table for them and it'll be fine. You're great at this stuff." He didn't mean it as a compliment. He meant that I was efficient at absorbing the friction he created. He treated my anger like a quirk, not a reaction to what he was doing. I didn't argue. I didn't tell him that I was tired of being the one who handled things, that he had failed to communicate. Instead, I walked over to Sarah and Diane. "We're going to move to the basement," I told them. "It's quieter." I spent the next 10 minutes hauling a lamp and a few chairs down the unfinished stairs. The basement was cold, and the light was harsh, but it was the only place where Diane could actually hear herself think. As I walked back upstairs, I passed Lance and his father laughing about a golf game in the living room. I stood there for a second, holding the door to the basement open. I looked at the man I had married, who was currently treating our home like a hotel where I was the concierge. He had coordinated the tutor with his ex-wife, coordinated the visit with his parents, and coordinated the academic track for his daughter, all without a single conversation with me. I closed the basement door, shutting out the sound of their laughter, and went back to the kitchen to finish the carrots. I worked in silence. The thud of the knife against the board was the only thing I focused on. The roast came out of the oven at 5:15, the smell of rosemary and seared beef filling the kitchen. I plated the food with a mechanical precision, my movements tight. In the living room, Lance's father was talking loudly about a new zoning ordinance affecting the suburbs of Idaho Falls, his voice booming through the thin walls. I could hear the basement door creak open, and Sarah, the tutor, walking up the stairs with Diane. Diane looked gray. There were dark circles under her eyes, and she was clutching her notebook like a shield. Sarah followed her, looking slightly frazzled, her yellow backpack slipping off one shoulder. "We got through the module," Sarah said, her voice cautious as she looked at the crowded room. "She's a hard worker, but she's really exhausted." "Great job, honey!" Lance called out from the living room, not even standing up from the sofa. "See? I told you it would be fine." I didn't look at him. I handed Sarah a $20 bill for the travel fee, a detail Lance had forgotten to mention, and walked her to the door. As soon as the door clicked shut, the house felt smaller, the air thick with the forced cheer of his parents. Dinner felt like a play where I knew all my lines. I served the roast, the mashed potatoes, and the glazed carrots. I poured the water. I passed the salt. I listened to Lance's mother talk about a church fundraiser and how wonderful it was that Diane was in the advanced track. "It's such a relief that you and Janet are on the same page about her education," his mother said, beaming at Lance. "It's so rare to see exes coordinate so seamlessly. It really takes the pressure off the child." I felt a sudden, sharp heat rise in my neck. I put the serving platter down on the table with a thud that was just a bit too loud. "It certainly does," I said. I tried to make it a joke, a little jab to see if he'd catch it. "I'm just the one cleaning up the mess, so you two can keep pretending everything is seamless." Lance laughed, a small reflexive sound. "Mel's just tired. It's been a long weekend." His parents chuckled, treating my comment as a quirk of my personality. They didn't see the way I was gripping my fork. For years, I had played this game. I'd use a sarcastic comment or a dry observation to signal that I was unhappy, believing that if I pointed out the absurdity of the situation, Lance would eventually realize it was unfair and change it. I watched him carve the meat and realized I'd been hinting for years because it was safer than actually fighting. If I joked about it, I wasn't the difficult stepmother. I was just the funny, slightly stressed one. But the joke didn't work this time. It never worked. After his parents left and the dishes were stacked in the sink, the house fell into a heavy, ringing silence. Diane had already retreated to her room to collapse into sleep. Lance was leaning against the counter, scrolling through his phone. "The module is done," he said, not looking up. "Monday should be a breeze." "I want to know why I'm not on the email threads," I said. The tone was different. I didn't laugh. I didn't use a metaphor. I just stood there in the middle of the kitchen, smelling like roast beef, and feeling a bitterness I couldn't swallow. Lance paused, his thumb hovering over the screen. He looked at me, his expression shifting into that polite, confused mask. "What do you mean?" "I told you the school is just weird about the primary guardian thing." "Don't give me the school's policy," I said. "The tutor had a learning plan. The tutor had a priority list. You and Janet wrote that list. You coordinated the tutor's schedule. You decided on the track change. All of it happened in a parallel world where I don't exist, yet I'm the one who clears the table and drives the car." Lance sighed and set the phone down. He rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding my eyes. "It's not a conspiracy, Mel. It's easier. Janet can be very particular. If we spend 3 hours debating every little detail of Diane's schedule, nothing ever gets decided. If I just handle it with her, we get a result, and then we can just move forward. And I'm the one who moves the furniture to make that result possible," I said. "You're great at the logistics," he said, and he actually sounded like he meant it, which made it worse. "I know you're a planner. You're better at the day-to-day stuff than both of us combined. I figured you'd rather just know the plan than have to deal with the bickering between me and Janet." I stared at him. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. He had built a system where he got the authority and the peace, Janet got the control, and I got the labor. "You didn't think I'd mind being excluded from my own household's decisions?" I asked. "I didn't think it was excluding you," he replied, his voice getting defensive. "I thought I was protecting you from the drama. Why make it a big deal? The work is getting done. Diane is in the class. The tutor is here. Everyone is winning." "I'm not winning," I said. "I'm an employee who doesn't get a say in the company." Lance shifted his weight, looking toward the living room. He didn't apologize. He didn't say he was sorry for the secrecy. Instead, he tried to frame it as a favor. "Look, I just wanted things to be smooth with Janet, and I knew you'd make it work on the ground," Lance Rocha admitted, finally acknowledging that he had separated the formal decisions from the daily work, because it was simpler to coordinate with his ex-wife without having to negotiate the logistics with me. I felt a strange, cold stillness settle over me. The admission didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a confirmation. He hadn't forgotten to include me. He hadn't been clumsy with the communication. He had made a strategic choice to keep me in the role of the operator because it served his need for a conflict-free life. "I can't do this anymore," I said. "Do what, the algebra?" he asked, genuinely confused. "The making it work part," I said. I walked out of the kitchen and went into the bedroom. I didn't slam the door, but I closed it firmly. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my phone. I had a fleet audit at 6 a.m. on Monday. I had a daughter who was exhausted and a husband who viewed my competence as a reason to keep me in the dark. I thought about the access restricted message on the laptop screen. For the first time, I realized that the restriction wasn't just a school policy. It was the blueprint for my marriage. I lay back on the pillows, listening to the sound of Lance, humming to himself in the kitchen, probably thinking that the drama had passed and that tomorrow would be just another day of me making everything work. I didn't leave that night, but I stopped operating. I spent the next 2 weeks as a ghost in my own house, doing only the things that directly concerned me. I stopped checking the school portal. I stopped coordinating the tutor. I stopped prepping the meals that Lance and his parents expected to find on the table. When Lance asked why the laundry wasn't folded or where Diane's gym bag was, I told him the same thing every time. I wasn't sure, and since I wasn't on the primary guardian list, I figured he had it handled. The friction he had spent years avoiding finally arrived, and it was loud. He and Janet started arguing over the phone about who was responsible for the tutor's payment and who had forgotten to sign the field trip waiver. I listened to them from the other room, feeling a strange, detached curiosity. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just observing the system failing without its hidden support. By November, I had a lease on a small one-bedroom apartment on the north side of town, closer to the Fleet Yard. Moving was a quiet process. I didn't have much that wasn't shared, but I took my books, my work clothes, and the good set of knives I'd bought myself. Lance didn't fight me on the move, but he looked bewildered, as if I'd suddenly decided to speak a language he didn't understand. He kept asking when I was getting over this, as if my departure was a mood swing rather than a decision. I didn't explain it again. I had already given him the blueprint. He just didn't like the layout. The real test came in February. Idaho Falls was buried under a week of heavy, wet snow that turned the suburbs into a series of white mounds. I was sitting in my living room, drinking coffee, and looking at a fleet schedule on my laptop when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Lance. Diane has a dentist appointment at 3 tomorrow. I have a loan closing that's running late. Can you pick her up from school and take her? I stared at the message. A year ago, I would have checked my calendar, shifted my lunch break, and handled the logistics without a second thought. I would have been the one to remember the fluoride treatment and the insurance card. I typed back. I can't. I'm working until 5. It's just an hour, T, he replied. Janet can't do it because she's on a double shift at dispatch. You're the only one who can make it work. I'm not the operator anymore, Lance, T, I wrote. You and Janet need to coordinate a ride. Maybe one of you can leave early or find a carpool. He didn't respond for 20 minutes, then he sent, This is ridiculous. You're punishing a 13-year-old because you're mad at me. I'm not punishing anyone, Teh, I replied. I'm just staying in my lane. The one you decided for me. I put the phone face down on the coffee table. I felt a flicker of guilt, but it was small and distant. I knew Diane was probably annoyed, and I knew Lance was scrambling, but for the first time, the scramble belonged to him. 2 days later, Lance called me. He didn't sound angry. He sounded tired. He had spent the last few hours trying to navigate a disagreement with Janet about a new orthodontic plan, and for the first time, there was no one to absorb the impact. I messed up, he said. His voice was flat, lacking the usual polite polish. I didn't realize how much I just used you as a buffer. I treated your help like it was a utility, like the water or the power. I just assumed it would always be there, so I didn't have to deal with the hard parts of co-parenting. It wasn't a perfect apology. He didn't mention the years of exclusion or the way he'd dismissed my feelings as drama. But it was a concrete admission of the wrong. What's changed? I asked. I started a shared email thread with Janet for everything, he said. No more parking lot conversations. Everything is written. If it's not in the thread, it doesn't happen. I'm the one checking the portal now. I'm the one handling the tutor's invoices. And the rides? I'm figuring it out, he said. It's a lot harder than I thought it would be. I didn't tell him I was sorry. It was hard. I didn't tell him I missed Diane. I just told him I was glad he was handling it. We still talk, and I see Diane occasionally, but the dynamic has shifted. The written and narrow rule for their co-parenting has actually made things more stable for her. She isn't caught in the middle of a whispered agreement that I then have to execute. She knows who is responsible for what, because there is a digital trail. Trust is a slow thing to rebuild, and in my case, I don't know if I want to rebuild it with him. The memory of that access-restricted screen is still too vivid. I don't miss the labor, and I don't miss the feeling of being a ghost in my own kitchen. I spent my Saturday afternoon rearranging my new bedroom. I bought a sturdy oak desk and a high-quality lamp, placing them exactly where the light hit best in the afternoons. I spent an hour organizing my planners and my work files, setting up a space that was designed for my needs and my schedule alone. I stood back and looked at the room. There were no hidden expectations here, no parallel systems, and no one waiting for me to smooth the pavement. It was just a room, prepared for its actual use.